I'm very disappointed in myself. I was intending to start off my Nehemiah study with my Nehemiah joke, which, I'm not really a joke guy. I don't have a lot of jokes, but I do have one for Nehemiah. And so I guess I'll say it now. This is quality content. I mean, this is not something that you can get everywhere. Who was the shortest person in the Bible? Well, a lot of people think it was Nehemiah. But it actually wasn't. It was Bildad, the Shuhite, in Job chapter 2. So, that'll do it for our study today. Remember to subscribe for more enlightening content tomorrow. Well, if you're still here after that, then I commend you for your dedication to Bible study. We are going to take a look at Nehemiah chapter 9 today, and I do not have any more jokes. Unfortunately, but I don't have any more. Let's talk about Nehemiah chapter 9. We are going to be really in the same timeline today. Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem about 444 BC, and we are kind of finishing up the first year of him being there. He is a very productive man who gets work done very quickly. So we've talked about a lot in that first year of Nehemiah's arrival. Nehemiah himself is not going to be largely focused on in chapter 9. We're going to talk about the Levites. The Levites led the people of God in a period of praise and worship and thanksgiving in this chapter. The police have come to arrest me for my bad jokes. We're also going to talk about the Jews, or the people of Judah. They were descendants of the tribes of Israel, and they made an oath to keep God's commands after years of their forefathers neglecting them. And for yet another chapter, our map has not really changed. We are going to be focused on the territory of Judah, specifically the capital, which was the city of Jerusalem. Going over to our second page now and taking a look at our outline, I have 3 sections for our 38 verses, and the first one is verses 1 through 5, a sober assembly of confession. Now, we're still in the 7th month, so keep in mind the stuff that we talked about, the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, we talked about in a previous study. That all happened in the beginning of the 7th month. We're still in that 7th month on the 24th day now. So on the 24th day, the people of Judah assembled for a period of mourning and fasting because of their sins and their neglect of God's law. They spent a quarter of the day reading from the book of the law of God, and then they spent a quarter of the day confessing their sins and worshiping. The Levites stood up and they prompted the people to worship the Lord by reciting some of his great deeds and his great kindness to the nation of Israel in the past, throughout their history. And the history that they recited is recorded in verses 6 through 37, so that's what we're going to talk about next. So verses 6 through 37, God's faithfulness and Israel's unfaithfulness. And all of this history you're going to be familiar with if you've done our previous studies with us, because this is the history that's recorded in books like Genesis, Exodus, Joshua, and the previous books of the Bible. God was worthy of the people's worship because he was the creator of the heavens and the earth. He chose Abram, and he promised to give his descendants the land of Canaan to be their home. That's what we call the promised land. That's why it's the promised land, is because God promised it to Abraham. God helped Israel to escape Egyptian slavery, and he walked them through the Red Sea in the book of Exodus. God led them through the wilderness, remaining faithful to them, even though they turned their back on him many times. We're going to see here a pattern of God being faithful, merciful, forgiving to his people, even though they're going to mess up continually. God gave his people his laws on Mount Sinai, even though he knew that they would break them regularly, often, and generationally. God's people were stiff-necked, which is kind of the Bible's way of saying stubborn in their sins, and blasphemous. But God was overflowing with grace. God gave Israel victory over the inhabitants of the promised land and gave them that land. He settled them in their new homes. But after he had settled them in their new homes, Israel forgot about God and his instructions. God disciplined them and they repented for a while, but it wasn't long before they just cast God's law once again behind their back and left it behind. They killed his prophets and they committed blasphemies according to verse 26 of chapter 9. God let foreign nations punish Israel for their disrespect. Nevertheless, he never gave up on Israel, and he never broke his promises to Israel. He even let Babylon take his people out of the promised land. But even after that, he had allowed Cyrus to give them permission to return decades later. And that's the period of history that we're talking about in Nehemiah and Ezra. Nehemiah and Ezra and all of the people admitted their failures as a nation, which prompted them to this period of worship because it highlighted God's incredible patience with them and his mercy and his forgiveness. While the Jews still weren't totally free of all foreign powers, they were still subjected to the Persian Empire and to the kings, and they still had to pay their taxes. Their persistent existence was a testament to the long-suffering goodness of God. And they recognized that here, and they praised him for it. Our final section in this chapter is just the final verse, verse 38, a covenant in writing. The princes of the Jews, the Levites, the priests, and the governor, Nehemiah, signed a written promise, a written oath that they were going to respect God and they were going to keep his commandments and resolve themselves once again to be God's people. And the names of the signers of this list are mentioned in the beginning of Nehemiah chapter 10. So that's where we were going to pick up tomorrow, Lord willing. For our application today, I couldn't resist. I know that this is something that we've addressed in previous studies, but I think it's worth bringing up again because you do hear it all the time. I have to again address the accusation that many people make that the God of the Old Testament is cruel and devoid of grace, and that he's somehow different from the God that we see in Jesus, or the God of the New Testament, as they would refer to him. If you ever hear this accusation from somebody, please ask that person, have you ever read the Old Testament, the entirety of the Old Testament? It's easy to proof text one chapter out of the hundreds in which God punishes people and to be like, look how vicious the God of the Old Testament used to be. But when you read the entirety of the Old Testament, as many of you have done now, as we've been studying through all of these chapters together, when you read these chapters about God's punishment in context of the larger Bible story and in the context of the history of Israel, you realize that each one of these chapters of punishment is separated by centuries of forgiveness and mercy and undeserved patience. In this chapter is a rejection out of the mouth of God's own people that God is cruel. Right? The Israelites, the people who were being punished by God on many of these occasions, rejected the idea that God was cruel, because when they had their heads on straight, they realized that, God has been really, really good to us, really patient with us. But, there is a point at which he punishes, and when that happens, it's because we deserve it. So if you ever hear this accusation brought up, take them to this chapter and say, these people, God's people in the Old Testament certainly did not see him this way. Why would you read that interpretation of the God of the Old Testament into these pages when God's own people wouldn't agree with you? So that's our study for today in Nehemiah chapter 9. Lord willing, we'll be back tomorrow to talk about chapter 10.